No, thank you so much. The pleasure is all mine. What a great opportunity to speak with this group today and share some updates that we have from the Department of Homeland Security. So appreciate the warm welcome. My plan was to walk through some updates that we have around what we're doing at the Department of Homeland Security around supply chain resilience, primarily the creation of a new center that we've recently stood up, some of the activities that we've been working on to date, and then areas where we're going to be looking to focus in the future. And would love to then save some time at the end for some questions on this or other related topics. But let me dive right in. First off, as a bit of a scene setter, I think that everyone here would appreciate and agree with the fact that we are in a new world and facing a new kind of warfare and threat, and that we're no longer constrained by borders or military maneuvers when we talk about these types of risks. In fact, we face a very different world today compared to the one that we knew in 2003, which is when the Department of Homeland Security was first formed. We've got a world today that is much more interconnected than any time that I can recall in DHS's 21 plus year history. This is brought about by ubiquitous cutting edge technologies. We've got economic and political instability, and our global economy has erased borders and increasingly brought threats and challenges right to our doorsteps, into our communities, into our hospitals, into our businesses, into our local governments, and even into the critical infrastructures. So we've got a situation here where our homeland security has really converged with our broader economic security and our national security. We're seeing where those who wish to harm us can exploit the very openness that defines this modern world. And they're able to do so through trade, through investment flows, and through the rapidly evolving technologies that connect us, and through the information that we see spread around the world by just the click of a mouse. So all of this is also a situation where we're seeing pandemics and other types of biological threats, cyber attacks, climate shocks, extreme weather events, geopolitical and economic competition, and other types of conditions that can really reduce the critical manufacturing capacity and the availability and integrity of critical goods, products, and services. Additionally, we know that even a single point of failure in a supply chain can really trigger outside disruptions and impact supply chains across different industries and at the regional level, of course, but also increasingly at the national and even worldwide level. We just saw some of the risks of global concentration in information technology with the recent CrowdStrike outage that impacted businesses and government operations around the world, and that we're still trying to get our arms around the impacts of and mitigations that can be put in place to reduce future occurrences. So that outage underscored the specific need to, yes, diversify software providers, but it also highlighted an important topic in a broader imperative where we need to be identifying and addressing single points of failure across America's critical infrastructures and the supply chains that support them. So supply chain disruptions have become, I think we'd all agree, more frequent and more severe overall. If you think back to what's happened just in the last few years during the pandemic, we've seen a backup of containers at the ports of LA Long Beach, shortages of semiconductors, and parking lots full of cars that couldn't go to market because they were just missing one or two semiconductor chips. And this is dovetailing with a lot of geopolitical risks. We've got a lot of questions about the long-term reliability of having supply chains in China after decades of the business community really looking to China as the world's factory floor. And we also have ongoing conflict in the Ukraine that's affecting food supplies and other critical supply chains. So it's really true that we've seen narrowly scoped resource shortfalls in the past. They've been far from uncommon in American history. However, I think we're seeing concurrent multi-sector commodity shortages both during and after the COVID-19 pandemic And it's really starkly illuminating the need for the US government, for DHS, but of course the broader US government as well, to better understand how global transnational supply chains operate, and to better anticipate where shortfalls of critical commodities may really trigger some of these broader impacts. And ideally find a way to head them off altogether instead of being reactive and responding once a crisis has already manifested. So Tracy, if you want to jump to the next slide for me. As a result of this, I think it's fair to say that we're probably at an inflection point of change where we're seeing that national and homeland security has really converged with our broader economic security. So again, we've seen and watched this trend over at least the last decade, where the world has become increasingly interconnected and tied together. And I think we're at the pinnacle of that interconnectedness and openness, at least more than any other time in DHS's 20 plus year history. And this has generated some tremendous opportunities and tremendous advantages for people and businesses through open trade and investment flows. But it's also bringing a new type of risk directly into our ports, to our transportation infrastructures, to our communication systems, our energy grids, our financial institutions, our healthcare systems, and much more. And you see in the aftermath of disruptions, governments can be encouraging or frankly even requiring critical businesses to adopt practices that enhance the resilience of respective supply chains. And this can be a strain, and industries can balk, understandably, at the adoption of such policies, particularly if they come at the price of operational efficiency or increased production or transportation costs. So while we've seen history is often replete with examples of the negative economic consequences associated with economic models that rely exclusively on domestic production, I do think there remains a space where the government and DHS can positively influence select industries to secure their supply chains, to take a hard look at where their supply chains may be resilient and where more resiliency could be built in to help mitigate against emerging supply chain crises. So this is really where DHS is working to leverage its existing authorities and its historic mission and some new authorities and new capabilities to work hand in hand with the private sector, with other agencies, with other governments, to help build up resiliency in supply chains that we know are going to be vital to Homeland Security. So the bottom line here is that Homeland Security today, in my view, has a different meaning than it did in the wake of 9/11, where we were focused mainly then on safeguarding the United States against foreign terrorism. Homeland Security is now increasingly includes this concept of economic security. That is, this condition of having a secure and resilient domestic production capacity combined with reliable access to the global resources that are necessary to maintain standards of living and, importantly, to support the critical industry infrastructures that citizens rely on every day. So at DHS, this means that we're continuing to focus on enabling the lawful flow of goods and services, people and capital, and information and technology across our borders. And in addition, it means that we're increasingly focused on not only minimizing disruptions to supply chains as they may occur and recovering from disruptions, but increasingly understanding emerging risks and identifying key supply chains, and then proactively and collaboratively putting in place measures to mitigate them. So this is where we're building resilience, and it is now a key priority, not only in DHS, but across the administration. Tracy, do you want to jump to slide 3? Thanks. So as I said, robust supply chains are just absolutely fundamental to a strong economy. While supply chains are often efficient, we know that instabilities can have up and downstream knock-on effects that obstruct or altogether halt operations and suppliers. And the public and the private sector have developed over the years, and even in recent months, a number of workarounds for key supply chains that are critical to many of today's security issues. and to the not only the defense industrial base, but to the homeland security industrial base. And this requires plans that may already be in place or that can be rapidly developed or modified in the event of a supply chain disruption or interruption. But we've also seen President Biden and this administration and DHS make supply chain resilience a priority from day one. One example is by signing the executive order on America's supply chains and establishing a supply chain disruption task force that had worked with states, tribes, local governments, businesses, and allies and partners to address acute supply chain crises that were caused by the pandemic. Since then, the administration has also made significant investments to strengthen supply chains and prevent future disruptions by, for example, expanding production capacity in key sectors, building infrastructure through the CHIPS and the Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. These efforts have been helpful in unsnarling supply chains and renormalizing the flow of goods. Moreover, this executive order reinforced the notion that close collaboration on resilient supply chains with allies and partners who share our values will help foster collective economic and national security and strengthen the global worldwide capacity to respond to even international disasters, disruptions, and emergencies. So let me jump now, if I could, Tracy, with the next slide, to focus on DHS, where DHS fits into this administration effort. So over the last 5 years, we've seen the stand-up of temporary ad hoc task forces, as similar to the disruption task force I just mentioned, that have often been under the purview of the National Security Council with the goal of helping coordinate among U.S. agencies, also engage with the private sector, and work to really encourage and expedite the production of critical supplies during supply chain crises. This included the Supply Chain Disruption Task Force that I just mentioned, which really brought a whole of government approach to relieving near-term supply and demand mismatches. We saw these specifically in the home building and construction, semiconductor industries, as well as transportation, agriculture, and food industries. So DHS had been a part of that task force and continues to support a newly created cabinet-level body by that name. And just as recently, President Biden directed DHS in November of 2023 to establish the DHS Supply Chain Resilience Center. So this is a new nerve center that we've stood up to help bring together the federal government, key industry players, to share data, to put challenges on the table, and then work together to develop actionable solutions. If we want to jump to the next slide, please. So the purpose of, the goal for the DHS Supply Chain Center is to develop a set of new capabilities, expertise, and capacities to help us forecast, model, and assess vulnerabilities that can arise when a particular supply chain is exposed to changes in supply and demand or other disruptions that can be brought about by market forces or by unexpected events. This means that we're really trying to enhance and build our capabilities to assess the elements of the supply chain that might be vulnerable and where additional resilience needs to be built in, looking at factors such as the transparency or our ability to sort of see all the way up into the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 elements of a supply chain. We're looking at the concentration of production, supplier concentration, the agility of supply chains to be able to move and be resilient and source from different locations, looking at geopolitical factors, as well as economic health and compliance factors around supply chains. So our goal here is to use these insights to inform policy action and to build supply chain resilience and strengthen the U.S. economy. To do this, if you jump to the next slide, Tracy, we're using a federated model. So as I had said before, DHS certainly has a big piece of this puzzle, but we're not acting alone. And you have likely seen the stand-up of similar supply chain centers across the interagency and indeed across the world. We're coordinating all the tools at the department's disposal through the establishment of our new Supply Chain Resilience Center. And what I mean by that is we've got within DHS a wide range of authorities, data, capabilities, and expertise. And we're using the Supply Chain Resilience Center as sort of a focal point to ensure that we're bringing those together and being able to best leverage those and utilize those to bolster supply chain resilience. And by placing the Supply Chain Resilience Center within the DHS headquarters structure, our aim is to ensure that our approach and our reach is holistic. And as importantly, that it's integrated with the broader array of federal activities, and that it's also tightly coordinated with the private sector, as we're all looking to co-develop practical mitigations that protect our economy. Let's jump to the next slide if we could. So additionally, the placement of this new Supply Chain Resilience Center within the Office of Policy at DHS headquarters is meant to also just be a practical acknowledgement of the specific and very express authorities that this office and this team in particular has regarding this new concept of, well, not new, but around this concept of economic security. We have express authorities within my office regarding the policy for policy formulation around matters of economic security and trade when those matters are impacting the mission and operation of the department. And we're also responsible for ensuring that overall economic security is not diminished by the efforts or the activities or programs within the department that are aimed at securing the homeland. So maintaining that balance and that awareness. Under my office, we're also working hard to remain vigilant against adversaries that attempt to use targeted investments in U.S. firms as another means to undermine the security of critical infrastructure. This is a key example of how we're implementing the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. So, for example, in U.S. ports, we know that while the acquisition of one small U.S. company by an adversarial or state-owned company may not pose a significant national security threat by itself, but multiple successive small investments across the sector, maritime sector, for example, could give our adversaries a foothold to exploit and appropriate key technology or intellectual property, or to gain access or proximity to a sensitive location. And so it's because of this that DHS has increasingly used its role in the U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, to lead and mitigate efforts, to lead review and mitigation efforts related to foreign investments in U.S. container terminals and in other locations. We're also looking very closely at state-owned company investments in global ports to ensure that our adversaries can't aggregate sensitive supply chain data, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, which can be exploited to target supply chain vulnerabilities. So let me jump to a bit of an overview of our current and potential, our current and future efforts. And I say potential here because we are, some of the benefits of doing engagements like this is that we do want to hear from stakeholders in academia, other stakeholders in other agencies, and of course throughout the private sector to really help us crystallize where we should be focusing many of our future efforts. But this is to give us a little bit of an overview of what we've done to date, where we are now, and what we're looking to focus on in the near future. So one area that we had near the start of our stand-up that we had worked on was around the unfortunate collapse of the Key Bridge in March. Of course, DHS was working very closely alongside a number of federal partners, with Maryland state officials, with private sector representatives and others, to respond immediately to the impact of the ports and the waterways. And that's something that U.S. Coast Guard, has primarily taken the lead on for the immediate operational response and recovery mission that was so vital to that effort. However, in parallel, the newly stood up Supply Chain Resilience Center was also working with the White House's Supply Chain Disruption Council to support their efforts to understand potential supply chain disruptions that might not have been immediately known or appreciated in the aftermath of the collapse. So the Supply Chain Resilience Center, we were working with DHS and with our components, including U.S. Customs and Border Protection, with U.S. Coast Guard, of course, with CISA, with FEMA, with TSA, to understand, to aggregate, and to assess the impact surrounding the collapse in the development of periodic impact and incidents reports that were going to the White House and to key decision makers within the department. And so that was within the hours and certainly into the days following the collapse. We also worked with other federal agencies to use our new analytic capabilities and the consolidation of some of this really vital information and expertise to provide situational awareness to the task force and, as I said, to some of our key leaders on what types of commodities were being impacted, what routes vessels could be taking or remained open to them, and capacities at other ports to ensure that we had historic as well as up-to-date trade data about imports and exports and countries of origin and destinations for goods, so that all of that could be tracked and provided to decision makers in aggregated dashboards. And so this was really helpful information to not only minimize some of these disruptions, but also help us exercise some of these new capabilities and these new networks and relationships that we're looking to build out through the Supply Chain Resilience Center. Another example of where the Supply Chain Resilience Center has been in action, we're looking to do more, is able to raise awareness and mitigate threats posed by particular vulnerabilities that have been identified. And when I say have been identified, vulnerabilities or risks that have been identified by the intelligence community, so within the government, have been brought to us by some components within DHS or even other agencies, or vulnerabilities or risks that have been brought to us, brought to our attention by private sector entities. And one example of these is work that we did around ship-to-shore cranes. We worked very closely with the U.S. Coast Guard and CISA, two key DHS components, to understand and assess that most ship-to-shore cranes installed in American ports, so these are major pieces of capital investments, are manufactured and made by a single state-owned enterprise in the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. And our concern was that if these become compromised, it could shut down port operations and port terminals completely, or have significant disruptive impacts. We know that these cranes handle a large amount of goods, but they also can and have the potential to be processing large amounts of data. And we want to make sure that we know where that data is and that it's not providing a strategic economic advantage and compounding vulnerabilities beyond compounding vulnerabilities of having that data utilized. So we also discovered an additional concern that there's no current domestic alternatives to these cranes, and that the crane manufacturing industry had departed the United States decades ago. So we had after the coordination and the engagement across the U.S. government with private sector entities and with foreign governments, we had a really great announcement with the Coast Guard and with the White House on new requirements for ports that are going to help them, first of all, understand this vulnerability and then defend against the cybersecurity threats that may be presented. And this announcement, I believe it was in March or for March or April. Someone will have to correct me on this, but it also highlighted a new infrastructure bill funding, about $20 billion worth, that was being leveraged from the infrastructure bill to create a domestic supply of these ship-to-shore cranes. So we know that about 90% of our cargo, I think the latest stat has entering our country through seaports, and that we're really dependent on the goods that move ports and the infrastructure that supports their movement. So by working together with the port operators, shipping companies, with critical equipment manufacturers, and then bringing our cyber experts to bear, we wanted to ensure that we were raising awareness around a potential vulnerability, providing guidance and cyber hygiene protocols that could be built into these port operations and to the use of this particular piece of equipment, towards the idea of building security, building resilience, and having the ability to head off a potential significant disruption to ports. So we knew that we couldn't tolerate that level of risks in such a critical part of our economy. So this is just one example of where we're creating trusted sources for this type of equipment, understanding and raising awareness about the vulnerabilities of different types of equipment, and keeping our ports and economy humming and putting real dollars behind it as we work with the industry to do so. Another example that I wanted to quickly touch on in this vein, where you see our desire to identify a risk, assess the vulnerabilities, and work collaboratively with industry, with academia, with foreign partners to really assess the potential impacts of a vulnerability, and then move it towards putting in place guidance or mitigation or collaborations ahead of time to address the vulnerability. Another example is work that we're doing around logistics platforms that are just really instrumental to the movement of goods around the world. So you saw us sort of start off with a particular piece of capital equipment, the ship-to-shore cranes. Now moving on to some of the logistics platforms and data integration capabilities that really help keep ports moving and share information between all the discrete parties that are part of an effective movement of goods across borders. One of the areas that we're now looking at the risks associated with is the risks associated with what we're seeing as a real widespread global adoption of the PRC's National Transportation and Logistics Public Information Platform, or LOGINC is the acronym, and similar types of platform. We know that these types of connected platforms like LOGINC can provide connectivity, as I said, among a variety of supply chain stakeholders, but we're also exploring the vulnerabilities associated with the vast amount of data that these systems are able to capture from users, including personally identifiable information, as well as proprietary business information, and potentially even touching government systems. So there is consensus, at least among our intel community and across the US government, that the aggregation of some of this trade and shipping data by adversary-controlled trade and logistic platforms could create an economic and strategic risk for the United States and even for partner countries. And we appreciate that trade and logistics data are just absolutely vital to be shared as normal functions of legitimate global trade, but we are looking to ensure that we are safeguarding sensitive and have regulatory controls in place and other types of best practices to mitigate the sharing of potentially sensitive data. We know from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence from recent reporting that they have that foreign adversaries increasingly view data as a strategic resource. And that this particular trade and shipping data that could potentially be collected by adversary-controlled trade and logistics, not only platforms but applications, can threaten U.S. national security, but also economic security, as this data could be used to inform or obfuscate or manipulate or even weaponize trade data to benefit adversaries' economic and geopolitical goals. So we've seen in this case that Congress has already acted. They've taken steps in, I believe it was the 2023 NDAA, recent legislation, let's leave it at that, where they are limiting the Department of Defense and Department of Transportation activities around the use of logging and other types of platforms, logistics management platforms, and really putting in guidelines around how U.S. entities can be using this platform. And so what we're doing at the Supply Chain Resilience Center is we're leading an effort across DHS components with the White House and with our federal partners to understand what additional best practices or mitigations can be put in place to ensure that the sensitive data that is potentially moving across these systems it remains secure, and that we've got consensus across U.S. agencies, with our international partners, and with the private sector stakeholders about sort of meaningful steps that can be taken to reduce risk in this critical economic security space. I'm going to jump just to one more example of how the Supply Chain Resilience Center is acting to build resilience into U.S. supply chains, because I want to make sure I'm leaving enough time for questions. One area that, or another area that we're looking at, and that we'd welcome feedback and engagement with the private sector, is looking at the undersea cable infrastructure. We know that if you asked an average person to list the most important infrastructure upon which their daily lives depend, you might hear, the power grid or transportation networks or maybe the cloud. But you probably wouldn't hear the global network of submarine fiber optic cables. However, this is the underwater network that's one of the most critical technology enabling systems of infrastructure in our world today. It carries over 95% of transoceanic traffic data, without which we wouldn't have our smartphones being able to function, our financial networks wouldn't be able to function, the communication systems would cease to work, and we would not have the reliability of the information communication systems upon which most facets of our everyday life rely upon. So as we're looking at undersea cables, we're increasingly focused on understanding what the impacts of the AI revolution will be. As AI is driving up demand for global data capacity, we know that this will need to be connected through undersea cable infrastructures. In fact, some experts we've talked to have predicted a 25 times the increase in capacity that'll be necessary to be built up over the next 4 years. And so, as with other critical infrastructures, we know that submarine cable networks are overwhelmingly owned and operated by the private sector, and securing them is going to require government and industry to work together to identify and figure out how to mitigate the risks in this particular threat environment. So to stay ahead of this threat, the Supply Chain Resilience Center is working with DHS components across the interagency and with key private sector stakeholders to really assess the undersea cable landscape, its network, its susceptibility to capacity disruptions, and sort of what those implications from an expanded network that may be necessary to support AI advancements, to understand sort of what the risk landscape is there and what potential mitigations or best practices we'd want to put in place to mitigate concerns coming out of that. Let me jump, if I could, to the final slide, Tracy. So, and just wrap up here, leave some time for questions to just note that we've got this new Supply Chain Resilience Center stood up. I think we're 7 months old now or so. While it's fairly new, we're really gaining some good momentum. And again, the key point here is that we want to have a hub where we're bringing together this broad range of skills and expertise that we have available throughout the Department of Homeland Security and throughout the many components that constitute the DHS Homeland Security enterprise, but also with federal partners, with academia, and with the private sector to help us proactively identify threats and then develop solutions, best practices, and mitigations to help mitigate some of those supply chain threats before we actually see them manifested and become a reality. So with that, I want to thank you again for the chance to speak today, and hope we've got some great questions or comments from the group.
Christa, thank you very much. This is Greg. Folks that have joined us as we were kind of midway, just let you know that you're free to ask questions by just turning on your microphone and asking, and then turn it off. Or alternatively, you can type something into the chat and we'll get the question asked if it's pretty quickly right after that. Just want to take a minute, Christa, just to ask one quick question, maybe a couple, but it's incredible what you guys are trying to accomplish in such a short period of time. And it's amazing how well you've done in kind of marshaling the resources, and certainly from the DHS Centers of Excellence, we've recognized kind of just this incredible cadence to move forward, which is wonderful. Let me ask you though, on in terms of some of the work with international partners and so forth, we recognize how important it is to deal with the businesses that often know a lot, or maybe way more than we know about their supply chains. But what role do international partnerships play in strengthening U.S. supply chains?
Really indispensable. And I think international partnerships, when you're talking about government to government, but also government to business, dealing with sort of global corporations. One of the areas where we are looking to formalize some of the relations that we've established with foreign governments is to sign agreements or memorandums of understandings, or just the statements of intent, but just basically formalize our ability to work with equivalent structures in other governments. So for example, for certain allied countries or key trading partners, we want to have connectivity with the equivalent of our Supply Chain Resilience Center. And other governments either are standing these up, or frankly have these had them stood up for decades, depending on sort of the state of their industrial policy over the last several decades. So where we can learn lessons from established supply chain resilience centers from other countries, we're looking to do that. And where there's an interest in sort of co-creating as we go, we're also looking to do that with some key partners with whom we have very deep and very deep trading relationships. So that's on the government side, where we're creating the connectivity and sort of exploring what type of data would be useful for sharing, what kind of exchanging information about sort of the capabilities, the analytic capabilities that everyone has, and kind of what's new, what's emerging, what's most helpful, understanding where, what types of supply chain mapping capabilities and sort of the findings that they've had from certain entities, or what their foreign investment screening structure looks like. So those are sort of the government to government conversations. And then, as I had said before, engagement with the private sector is really critical, because a lot of the critical infrastructure that we're trying to protect, let's say the subsea cables, as I had mentioned, it's owned and operated by the private sector. And so we're really working with those stakeholders to understand, first of all, to understand the current layout, like the mapping of those supply chains and sort of their projected growth, concerns they have with the federal touch points that are necessary, sort of through a regulatory process or review process, and what's going to be necessary to expand to meet the demands of things like AI. And then also, as they're building out some of these new systems, to take a look at sort of the cyber hygiene protocols that are in the current systems, sort of update those, but also build in new capabilities and new measures to make future systems even more secure. So kind of a top level answer, but indispensable is the short answer to how we're viewing engagements with the private sector and with other governments.
Thank you. Another one, unless somebody just raise their hand, they'll get me quiet here soon. But so it's interesting when I look at the work that you guys are doing, whether it's with the cranes, the logistics platforms, or the undersea cables. You know, that's an incredible arrangement or array of issues that kind of been brought to the fore on by your crew. You know, are there certain approaches that you all use to identify critical supply chain bottlenecks and vulnerabilities or dependencies? And if so, you know, just some sense of what those are.
Yeah, I guess I'd say twofold in the way that we're identifying them. One is, you know, ones that are just sort of manifest that we know that are apparent and need to be tackled immediately. And those are things like the ship-to-shore cranes, like the logging, where we've got, you know, public reporting or congressional interest, and or the intelligence community has sort of weighed in. And so those are areas that are sort of right at our feet where we're taking action. You know, looking forward, you know, as we're looking to identify other types of dependencies, I'd say that is where we're looking to get inputs through engagements like this. We meet quite often with companies that have been looking inward at their own supply chains and sort of understanding and uncovering vulnerabilities, that then they're sharing that information with us, particularly if there's a broader homeland security concern or implication to a potential to a potential supply chain disruption, and using those as opportunities to sort of build this playbook, if you will, of, you know, understanding, educating, and then looking across the array of tools that DHS or the interagency may have that can then be put in place to mitigate. And by tools, I mean everything from, you know, the just sharing information, sharing best practices, you know, across that arc to something that would be more of the regulatory end of the spectrum. So again, twofold of where we're getting those the inputs about what's next to tackle, picking from sort of what's out there and what's already been identified, but then also through our engagements, understanding what's nearest to us and most concerned to industry and to the stakeholders that provide critical services and support national critical functions.
Excellent, thank you. Kind of following on a thread there of, could you tell me what's the role of technology and AI in ensuring resilience and security of the supply chains?
$1 million question, but yeah, we couldn't have a discussion without AI. You know, I think that you know, certainly has opened up some new challenges, but also a tremendous breathtaking amount of potential here. You know, maybe a good way to answer this is to talk a little bit about how DHS is leveraging AI, particularly for the Supply Chain Resilience Center. You know, the Secretary Mayorkas has created what's called the AI Core, and this is taking a page out of the book of U.S. Digital Services, which was a group of private sector folks that were coming in, I think under the Obama administration, it was stood up to come in and help the U.S. government with really thorny tech issues. At the time, it was I think the VA was having some issues with one of their case management systems, and the healthcare app was also having some issues. And here at DHS, we were also looking to modernize the automated commercial environment, which was essentially the backbone where government to private sector trade data is exchanged, and customs is able to make admissibility determinations based on the information that the trade is giving them. So we are looking to modernize that system. And at that time, U.S. Digital Services came in and sort of helped government make sure that we were really leaning into had access to the best and the brightest, but also were building systems for the future. And so what Secretary Mayorkas has done with the AI Core is to, as I said, take a page out of that book and invite in private sector, software engineers and other types of folks from tech companies to really ensure that we're leveraging AI and have the ability to utilize it in furtherance of the DHS mission set. And for the Supply Chain Resilience Center, we're working with this group, subset of the group of the AI Core, to explore how we can be better leveraging sort of the data across DHS components and the expertise across DHS components to give us, to enable better decision making and better policy making. And what I mean by that is you've got, U.S. Customs and Border Protection with all the information that they've got about imports and exports, and Transportation Security Administration about, people and transportation systems within the United States and people coming across borders. You've got U.S. Coast Guard, who's got sort of course, looking at all the vessels and knowing where they are globally and as they approach U.S. ports, and CISA having really just incredible networks of relationships with private sector owners and operators, risks associated with different infrastructures, and also sort of cyber vulnerabilities and more. And so what we're looking to do is not recreate that within the Supply Chain Resilience Center, but have the capacity to have access to that data and to use it to be more predictive in understanding where we are seeing supply chain vulnerabilities. So we're not having to wait for an impact or a disruption to happen, but we're able to know that we've got, certain types of commodities that are going to be really critical to the continued operation of, let's say, an energy grid, or let's say a key DHS function. So really to identify the key commodities and the key assets that support the Homeland Security enterprise, and have the analytic capability to monitor the health of these key supply chains, but then also increasingly set up alerts that give us a sense of risks that we might not have envisioned. And so that's where I see the potential of that AI is going to be able to unlock for us, not only enabling us to connect the information that we already have within DHS and to be better able to use it, but then also to ensure that we're using that information to be much more predictive and look ahead at potential mitigations, so that we are better positioned to then figure out which tool in our toolbox we'd be able to deploy to mitigate those disruptions, or to resolve the issue before it even becomes a disruption.
Fantastic. It's always amazing when you think about the role of kind of trying to ensure security, but at the same time, speed the delivery of goods across the border. Those are not things that necessarily happen in concert, but what you're doing and the way you're approaching it certainly is making it possible. So thank you so much. I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any questions. If anyone has one that they want to just open their mic and ask, please do. If you're thinking about or formulating your question, I just want to first thank you, Christa, for an excellent presentation. And I would really hope that we could get you back here at some other point and just hear more about the accomplishments of the center, because the work that you're doing is tremendous. One of the things that we have, I do have a question that's come in from Hans Petrie. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Just open up your mic and then mute afterwards.
Sure. I missed the earlier part of the presentation, so you may have covered this, but when you were talking about the ship-to-shore cranes, you mentioned the data that were there that was possible. I'm just curious, I don't understand what data actually would get processed through a crane like that. Certainly not all of the shipping data, but I know it needs to come off the ship and get put to the right place in the port, either on a truck or a storage area. But what other data are they processing that would be vulnerable?
Right. Sorry, am I on mute still? No, there we go.
No, you're good.
Thanks. Yeah, so for I think the logistics platforms and the movement of the data between or on some of those logistics platforms is really where you're seeing the most risk of exploitation of that aggregated data. For the ship-to-shore cranes, it really depends on, and I'm not the crane expert, but I understand it really depends on sort of how that crane is set up. And whether it's linked, it's a standalone piece of equipment or whether it's linked into some other type of port management system, and how that is operated within the port authority or by the container terminal. But some of the concerns around the data would be just, I guess, operation of the crane, volume. But you're right. You're certainly not getting insight into like a commodity in the actual container that's being moved by the crane. It would just be more situational information about the operation of that crane. And I think the potential to, if that crane was connected to a system that allowed remote access, to have that crane not work in a key time, that in a way that would be not where the operator would potentially lose control of the ability to keep that crane functioning.
Okay. So even though we're not manufacturing the cranes themselves, we could rewire or put the information systems in independently of that to try and mitigate that vulnerability.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's both a hardware and a software component here.
Great.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Hans. Question from Holly Bisbee. Is the Supply Chain Resilience Center doing any work with CBP's Green Trade Strategy?
I'm aware of CBP's Green Trade Strategy. I don't know that we've got any formal initiatives underway with them. We are exploring with them sort of things that specific discrete projects, if you will, that are, I think, would be part of their green trade strategy, but I don't think we have any formal arrangements with them.
Great. Well, we are almost out of time. I want to thank everyone and Christa again. And I just want to also put in a plug for some work that when Christa talks about leveraging and partnerships, the two DHS centers of excellence, the Center for Accelerating Operational Efficiency and our center, CBTS, are hosting a workshop entitled Supply Chain Resilience Issues, Problems and Solutions for the Homeland Security Enterprise, that the SCRC team has been very helpful in helping us develop and move forward. That's going to take place in Washington, October 1st and 2nd. It's going to be a fairly tight space to work with. We're going to be addressing food and ag issues, as well as semiconductor manufacturing and maritime and port operations. So again, we appreciate the work of SCRC and the team that they have, as well as a second effort that we're going to be doing in December, where they've also helped us kind of form with the National Bureau of Economic Research an opportunity for a conference that's looking at resilience in supply chains as well. So I want to make a plug for both of those, as well as just a last chance just to mention that in August, we are going to have Dan Gerstein here from RAND, who's going to be speaking about emerging technology and risk analysis and artificial intelligence and critical infrastructure. And so I think these kind of lend themselves. This talk is kind of just feeding into that one as well. Before I let you go, I've got a question that must be burning with, please, Don, go ahead.
Hey, thanks. Since you're plugging events, I also wanted to plug S&T and the NITRD cybersecurity group is co-hosting a workshop, an R&D workshop on protecting software and hardware supply chains on September 24th. So if anyone's interested in participating in that, please reach out to me and we'll get you connected to that group. Over.
And I see a Texas A&M plaque back there, so we'll do everything we can do to help you.
Thanks.
Christa, thank you so much, and thank you for all that joined us today. We'll have a recording of this up on our YouTube channel within a couple weeks at the latest. But again, look forward to hearing more about the good work of SCRC in the future, and certainly appreciate so much your efforts to speak with us today. So thank you, Christa.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for the time.
Thanks. Take care.